Okay, if we can gather now for the breakout session. If you can take your tables, please. We have a breakout session in here, and then we have a breakout session next door. Next door is Jessica Granis from the Georgetown University in Law, and Kelly Stevens from Syracuse University on Public Administration, and Hilary Cox from Duquesne University on Law. And in here we have Darlene Weaver looking after Ms. Hickman from Duquesne University on Theology, Richard Miller from Creighton University on Theology, and it's going to be nice conversations. So I'm just helping everyone settle down who are not settled down yet. Just take a chair, get yourself settled. Darlene, you're going to be looking after the papers here, right? Okay, I'll leave it to Darlene in here. Thank you.
Good morning. What a phenomenal plenary address that was. So we have some time for some breakout papers, and then we'll all reconvene in this room at 11:30 for a stakeholder discussion table. So in the interest of time, because we're already a little bit off of our schedule, I think what I'm going to do is have our three presenters share their papers one right after the other, so that we make sure that they all have an opportunity to do them. And then we'll devote whatever remaining time we have before the stakeholder session to some question and answer. So it's my pleasure to introduce our three speakers, and I'm going to identify them and the titles of their papers in the order in which they will present. First, we're going to hear from Lisa Nichols Hickman. Ms. Hickman is a PhD student in theology here at Duquesne University. She's also an ordained minister. And her paper is titled Sam's Not So Perfect World, Creation Justice and Eco-Social Disability. After Ms. Hickman, we'll hear from Dr. Richard Miller of Creighton University. He holds a PhD in theology at Creighton, and his paper is entitled Rethinking the Social Role of Universities in Response to Climate Emergency, which will, I think, provide a nice integrative moment with the paper that was presented on disaster preparedness and disaster responses from yesterday afternoon. And then finally, we'll hear from Mr. Nelson Araque, a PhD student in theology at Barry University. His paper is entitled Gift and Fiesta, Two Ways from the Hispanic Latina, a Perspective to Combat Climate Change. And we were very excited on the selection committee to bring some particular cultural perspectives to the slate of papers that we're able to share with you today. So please join me in welcoming our three speakers.
Good morning, everybody. I want to introduce you to Sam. Sam, isn't he a kid you just want to get to know? That furrowed brow, those crumpled overalls, and just that inquisitive look on his face as he looks out towards us. I met Sam through this painting, which won the National Portrait Prize in 2006, the inaugural kickoff portrait competition for the Smithsonian Institution. I'm curious about Sam. I want to know what makes him so full of resolve and spunk. And I also want to know, what does Sam see on the horizon? And why does it look like with that fence that Sam can't quite access a part of his world? I'm curious about Sam because I'm curious about my own daughter, Caitlin, who went out the door this morning. Caitlin has Down syndrome as well. She is dressed head to toe in blue and yellow as a cheerleader for the Wilmington Greyhounds. David Lenz, the painter of this image, is a proud father as well, and he painted this image of Sam because he wanted to honor disadvantaged Americans, our unsung heroes. I'm curious about Sam, and I'm also curious about Sam's world. And in this presentation, we're going to think for a moment about Sam, think for a moment about the land, the world behind him, and then spend some time thinking about that strange image of the sun that dominates almost 2/3 of this painting. In so doing, we'll look at Pope Francis's Laudato Si and his concept of integral ecology. And I would like to introduce, alongside those, a concept of eco-social disability as a new model for disability studies. But first, I want to pause, and I want to just wonder, why does this painting feel a little bit troubling? Is it the title of the portrait, Sam in the Perfect World, where we wonder if really things are as perfect as they might seem? Is it the slightly menacing view of the landscape behind Sam that seems strangely devoid of life? Is it the haunting glow of the sun's orb? Or is it the 21st chromosome, invisible to the eye, but that's a silent sculptor of Sam himself? Something's not so perfect in Sam's world. And in so looking, I want to wonder about the intersection of climate change, toxic chemicals, bioaccumulation, and disability, and wonder how we here in this room, theologians, ethicists, high school students, policymakers, and all people of goodwill, might consider the interconnections which shape our landscapes and our loved ones. This talk contends that Pope Francis took wonderful steps in creating a concept of integral ecology. But I'm wondering if it may be in a future encyclical he might consider the cyclical effect of climate change on toxic chemicals and their exacerbation through bioaccumulation in the Anthropocene and their capacity to cause disabilities, both genetic and neurological. So first, let's think for a moment about Sam. Sam represents one of 400,000 people living in the United States with Down syndrome. Across the globe, the numbers stretch to 6 million people. Despite those large numbers, according to Dr. Brian Scottco, a doctor at the Children's Hospital of Boston, over 92% of women who learn from prenatal testing that their child will have Down syndrome choose to abort the fetus. 92%. David Lenz, father to Sam and wonderful artist for this painting, addresses our world's perseveration on culturally conceived views of perfection in saying about this painting, in America today, perfection is highly valued. We dump loads of chemicals on our lawns to try and get rid of every weed and every dandelion. Perfection, I would submit, is overrated, and besides, I like dandelions anyway. In the painting, Sam assumes the role of presenter, host, even tutor of this most revealing examination of the civilization that humanity has made for ourselves. End quote. Sam's message and the artist's message is amplified by Pope Francis, who addresses those with disabilities in Laudato Si in paragraph 117. When we fail to acknowledge as part of reality the worth of a poor person, a human embryo, a person with disabilities, to offer just a few examples, it becomes difficult to hear the cry of nature itself because everything is connected. End quote. Pope Francis gives thanks in his encyclical to St. Francis himself and begins Laudato Si with a wonderful quote from Canticle of the Sun. Laudato Si, praise the Lord, mi Signor. He writes that St. Francis of Assisi celebrates each of the intricate parts of creation, and I'm quoting here from paragraph 11, by taking us to the heart of what it means to be human. Just as what happens when we fall in love with someone, whenever Francis would gaze at the sun, the moon, or the smallest of animals, he would burst into song. drawing all other creatures into his praise. His response to the world around him was so much more than intellectual appreciation or economic calculus. For St. Francis, each and every creature was a sister united to him by bonds of affection, and that is why he felt called to care for all that exists. End quote. It's clear from a quick gaze towards Sam and the perfect world that David Lenz is not unlike St. Francis. In a world that chooses abortion 92% of the time, David Lenz and his wife chose otherwise. And I love that this painting is a canticle to his son. Now a look behind Sam to the landscape behind him. When we think about the world that Sam lives in, we might think of the scholar in disability studies, Rosemary Garland Thompson, who invites consideration of the link between the world and our bodies. She says, disability is the transformation that occurs as flesh encounters the world. Disability is the transformation that occurs as flesh encounters the world. Here in Sam's world, there are two models for disability that sculpt his world. There's the first, the medical model of disability, which talks about disability as a physical impairment. And there's a social world that defines disability by a person's ability or not to move within the structures and institutions of our world. And if you can't, then you become a part of a minority group. While these are two helpful models for disability study, what's missing in the study of disability is a more circular model that begins to think about how disability is shaped prior to birth. Rather than in a medical world or in a social world, what happens in our landscapes that begins to create generations of disability? Recent scholarship shows the magnification of toxic chemical dangers by climate change. Climate change holds a threefold threat then. Toxic chemicals can increase because of the climate change. Creatures, our human beings' ability to tolerate those chemicals can be affected by climate change. And third, chemicals and their bioaccumulation within bodies may increase due to climate change. If we add this third model to disability studies of eco-social disability, we can then account for this human-created impairment through contamination of the commons. We need this. Paul Creighton, an atmospheric chemist, describes the Anthropocene as a new geological epoch characterized by pervasive human influence throughout Earth's systems. The cumulative condition exhibited by the Anthropocene is the effect that industrial humanity enforces as an evolutionary force affecting both ecology and biology. The resulting effect, then, is what is behind ethicist Willis Jenkins' assertion: we must then begin to re-enflesh human personhood within ecological relations. These scholars see something looming on the horizon. And I'm wondering if Sam sees something looming as well. And I wonder if he's looking out at us, inviting us to respond to the problems of his world. Pope Francis echoes the wisdom of ethicist Willis Jenkins. We've forgotten that we ourselves are dust of the earth. Our very bodies are made up of her elements. This begins to get into his concept of integral ecology. We breathe her air, the air of this earth, and we receive life and refreshment from her waters. We know that the quality of air affects our bodies, our babies, our livelihoods. Currently, scientists are working to publish a statement that says, in part, that air pollution increases risks for babies to be born with neurodevelopmental disabilities, including autism, ADHD, developmental delays, and behavior and learning problems. And we also know that work has been done to show the effect of damaged water on creating disability. There are clusters of Down syndrome that have been linked to ecological contamination in communities from Pampa, Texas, to Punjab, India. And I'm wondering if it would be helpful here if Pope Francis, in a future encyclical, pointed to the toxification that can occur within bodies due to toxic chemicals, their bioaccumulation, and their effects on genetics, the generations of disability, and future generations. Pope Francis uses the phrase integral ecology to talk about the deep interconnections of economic justice and human development and global solidarity in an age of climate change. He begins to talk about that in paragraph 21. Account must be taken of the pollution produced by residue, including dangerous waste present in different areas. Each year, hundreds of millions of tons of waste are generated, much of it non-biodegradable, highly toxic, and radioactive. Frequently, no measures are taken until after people's health has been irreversibly affected. End quote from paragraph 21. Perhaps Pope Francis is aware of towns like Kettleman City, California, and others like it where poverty has pushed the community to the margins and has become a dumping ground for toxic chemicals. With just over 1,500 citizens in 2010, a dozen children were born with a spectrum of genetic and neurological disorders. One child was stillborn. 3 additional children died before they reached toddlerhood. Author Jacques Leslie explains this cluster and the chemistry. Sure, the birth defect cluster could be a statistical quirk, but it is much more likely that environmental factors are to blame. Many residents believe a toxic waste dump 3.5 miles from town has poisoned the air, the soil, and the water. The pervasive uncertainty in this town, she goes on to say, about what caused the defects has kept some women in the town from even considering pregnancy. I think Pope Francis comes closest to understanding the full circle of eco-social disability rather than the integral when he reflects in paragraph 49, today, however, we have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Here's what we need to know today. Toxic chemicals can become mutagens if left unchecked. Climate change can exacerbate toxic chemicals and their mutagenic effect. Mutagens have the capacity to cause aneuploidies that cause abnormal numbers of chromosomes in cells. These aneuploidies create genetic disabilities. Our air and water can carry those chemicals, and climate change can exacerbate those. They accumulate in our bodies and in this earth. We need an eco-social model of disability to create not a linear model like the medical and social models, and even go a step further than the integral model that Pope Francis is beginning to talk about here in Laudato Si. There is a circulation of causation as society pollutes these rolling fields, generating impairment in our children who then encounter a society who ironically name them as disabled. An eco-social model of disability takes into account the ecological impact over time on human persons. Because of this call to eco-social disability, we are then faced with a full circle challenge that calls us from an understanding of the integral to a larger understanding of the circular. And here we look to the top 2/3 of the image. Isn't that a very strange sun? Actually, the judges in the National Portrait Prize said that caught their attention first, even before Sam. And I have to tell you, when I first saw this painting about 8 years or so, all I saw was the sun's aura. But then I talked to a friend in our Amish community in New Wilmington who's a midwife, and she said, that is an image of birth. Do you see how the call is still whole? From our conversation, I learned the call is a piece of membrane from the amniotic sac, and that in very few births the call remains whole. It's considered good luck at its lowest. It's considered kingship at its highest. One might consider this image a kind of cosmic coronation. In a world where toxic chemicals and climate change can all too easily create that cycle of eco-social disability, we need this defense of fertility. We need to celebrate Sam himself, and we also need to protect future wombs. Ethicist Willis Jenkins links the womb of each mother to the larger womb of the earth, the sustaining womb of all people. Because peril to one results in peril to the other, ecological and ethical decisions must consider both the world womb and the individual's womb. David Lenz, proud father, crowns his son Sam with the royal diadem. Blessing encircles his son. And I love that the collision of imagery here between the sun as call and the sun as cosmic halo invite consideration of circular care for the interconnections within creation, not simply as a common good for all people and for this earth, but for a cosmic dimension to the common good. And I give thanks here for Professor Duquesne and ethicist Daniel Scheid, who argues, the cosmic common good stresses humanity's intrinsic and even elevated dignity within a community of creatures who possess intrinsic dignity. The cosmic common good is more consonant with the broader tradition of Catholic social teaching and Catholic social thought, and indeed with the history of Catholic theology. The cosmic common good represents a better prudential defense of creaturely dignity, human and otherwise, as well as a theocentric ecological ethic rooted in a proper theological understanding of creation. End quote. Pope Francis we celebrate today for continuing the greening of the papacy, and we give thanks for his encouragement to look even beyond the sun at the end of Laudato Si in paragraph 243, where he envisions a cosmic common good we'll have together, perhaps an eternal life. There we will have a shared experience of awe, he says, in which each creature, resplendently transfigured, will take its rightful place and have something to give those poor men and women who will have been liberated once and for all. In the meantime, we come together now to take charge of this home, which has been entrusted to us. And don't we hear that in a new way after this morning? He continues, in union with all creatures, we journey through this land seeking God. Let us sing as we go. I conclude here by saying thanks to Pope Francis. This world needed to hear his remembrance of St. Francis' canticle to the sun. And I give thanks for David Lenz and his masterful portrait, A Canticle to His Son Sam. Both together prompt our care and compassion. They invite us to consider climate change, toxic chemicals, and their combined effect on all the Sams and other unsung heroes of this world. As we work together for tighter precautionary measures and the educational advocacy to which the Pope calls us, let us transform the cries of this earth, the cries of Sam and other disadvantaged Americans, those unsung heroes. Let us turn together their cries into song. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So my talk today is on rethinking the social role of universities in response to the climate emergency. Now, we talked a little bit at this conference about some of the issues regarding messaging. How do we talk about an overwhelming truth? And so one way, and there's lots of literature, I've been going through this, I teach a course on the origins and solutions of the climate crisis. And one option is to say, well, you just don't tell people the full truth because the full truth is paralyzing, and then it renders people inactive. They won't be active on the issue. And I've been thinking about that, and there's other literature that would suggest otherwise. But one sort of fundamental idea about telling the people the truth is procedural justice. Procedural justice means that you have to, if you're going to subject someone to risk, you need to inform them of that. We do that in hospitals. If you're going to subject somebody to risk, you've got to tell them what the risk they're being subjected to. Now, I'm not particularly subjecting you as any more than anyone else as part of the system subjecting the young people, and actually all of us now, to serious risks. So one option is, I think on procedural justice grounds, you have to tell people the truth. And in this, but I don't think, to avoid the paralysis issue, you have to tell them multiple truths. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do just briefly here, and then I'll talk about the universities. So the climate emergency, Mary Wood did a wonderful job of allowing me to cut about 15 slides, but, which I really appreciate, because I needed it. But I would say just one thing, and I think it's very important that she really showed what was many great things in that talk, but there's two universes. The cultural, political, social universe is a parallel universe. That universe is going to collapse fairly soon, within decades. What do we have to hold true is, what is nature telling us? What are its laws? And she mentioned, for instance, we often say the Obama administration's done wonderful things, etc. And just to give you just one other indicator of the scale, she had Jim Hansen on for carbon reduction measures of 7% starting in 2013, and by 2020, 15% reductions of CO2 emissions globally. That's a big deal, globally. Currently, international law divides responsibilities between the developed and the developing world. So the developed world, us, we have to go sooner. So, for instance, the Obama administration's proposal is a 17% reduction in CO2 emissions under 2005 levels. Okay? The world talks about not 2005 levels. They talk about reductions under a 1990 levels. So what we are actually proposing is a 3% reduction under 1990 levels. Kevin Anderson and Alice Bose, in a very famous paper on the emission reductions, showed that, well, what's required by the developed world is not 3%, 56% reductions by 2020, and 98% reductions by 2050 by the developed world. Okay? So that's the alternate universe. That's the universe that takes us to 4 degrees Celsius. That's a civilization-threatening universe. That is what our politicians are holding to. Now, they're under great pressure from the Republicans. I've met with high-level administrators in the EPA and the State Department, and their agencies are, many people, members of Congress want to get rid of their agencies, the whole thing. So that's the first part, the climate emergency. Now, we have a lot of tough presentations, so I'm going to talk about hope here a little bit. We've had some of this, but I'd like to bring it together. Technologically, Mark Jacobson at Stanford University, very distinguished engineer on this issue, has shown that we could power the world 50 times over on solar and wind with existing hydropower. He showed in 2 big papers, that we could transform the whole world to renewable energy by 2030, and the cost of doing so would be roughly equivalent to the cost of our present fossil fuels energy structure, if we factored in the health costs from the millions of people that we're killing and all the health diseases that come from particulate matters. Okay, so technologically we can do this. There's other papers that hold the same thing. Policy. Oops. Let me jump to public opinion, because it's my next slide. Public opinion. John Krosnick at Stanford. Some of the polling you get is kind of all over the place. John Krosnick at Stanford, I think, is the best polling person, because if you ask people, based on what you've read and heard, do you think that the planet's warming, you get about 56%. And John Krosnick says, that's a terrible question. You're asking them based on what they've read and heard. Okay? you're asking them functionally, what do other people think? What have you read? He said, but you have to ask them directly. If you ask them directly, do you think it's warming? You get 75% of Americans hold that the planet is warming. 74% thinks that human beings are the primary drivers of that. And 83% of Americans want to do something about it. That is, reduce emissions. This is state-by-state data. Now look at Mississippi. Should the government limit power emissions? 74%. Power plant emissions. 74% say yes. Alabama, 73%. Georgia, 73%. That's a huge majority. Right? So we already have public opinion. Yale did a study. 13% of Americans, this is really stunning, 13% of Americans are willing to engage in civil disobedience against organizations that make the climate problem worse. 13%. 24% of Americans are willing to fund organizations that engage in civil disobedience. That is serious stuff. So we have public opinion is much better than people realize. It's a very small majority who've captured a small number of senator and congressional leaders that are driving this problem. That's why I said yesterday that I think the issue is a hostage crisis. Policy. There we go. A fee and dividend approach. Okay, more hope. This is on Citizens Climate Lobby. Again, Citizens Climate Lobby, if you want to know what to do, go to Citizens Climate Lobby. Extremely helpful organization. They paid for the Regional Economic Modeling Institute, who's done modeling for all sorts of groups, including major fossil fuel companies, on economics. And what do they show? You put a fee, $10 a ton on CO2. You charge it on carbon. You charge it at the wellhead when you take out oil out of the ground or when you mine coal. You increase the fee $10 a ton a year. 100% of the revenue goes back to the public, so it's really not a tax. It all goes back to us. It's revenue neutral. That means income taxes are decline. Carbon taxes go up. What's the result? After 10 years, CO2 emissions in the United States declined 33%. After 20 years, CO2 emissions declined 50%, below 1990 levels. Jim Hansen does it at $15 a ton, and you get close to the science at $15 a ton. You can go look at Citizens Climate Lobby. We make more money. We are wealthier. We are healthier. We have more jobs. Okay? It's all there. So we can do this. We have policies to do it. We have technology to do it. The public opinion is there. 4, societies can change quickly, very quickly. Hosni Mubarak was the leader of Egypt in 18 days. He was a brutal dictator in Egypt. In 18 days, he was overthrown. Right? Things are not all cleaned up in Egypt. The point is, though, that you can have rapid change. It is possible. In 1989, who would have thought that the Berlin Wall would fall? 10 years ago, who would have thought, whatever people's opinions on these are, whatever thought that we would have basically gay marriage is legalized constitutionally? Who would have thought that? 20 years ago, who would have ever thought that we'd have an African-American president? Not many. Societies change quickly. We look at the climate problem. Oh, it's this terrible big global problem, and I'm just this little person in this little town somewhere in Pennsylvania or wherever the case may be. Is it a global problem? Yes and no. One reason it's not a global problem is because power is not distributed equally across the globe. It's not where is power concentrated. The United States has an enormous amount of power. The United States, if we do a fee and dividend, if we put a price on carbon, we can put a tariff on all goods coming from other countries. So if you do not have a carbon price on carbon in line with the science, we put a tariff on your goods until you do. And we're the largest economy in the world, the richest country in the world. We can transform the situation globally. Okay? And also, if we give funding to the Global South and technology, they can develop on a renewable energy pathway. Okay? So, and how does that work? So, American politics becomes enormously important. I told my colleagues this year, way back in 2009, 2009, we're going to the Copenhagen Accord. We didn't get climate legislation. We were roughly 7 votes short in the Senate. That's the guess. 7 votes short in the Senate, United States Senate. One of the senators was a Democrat from Nebraska, Ben Nelson. And I told my colleagues in my university, look, we're a very powerful place, we have great authority in the state, very well looked up to. If 1,000 of us get together and really push, we can push Nelson. If Nelson moves towards dealing with climate legislation, that sends signals to other senators. And so you could have, possibly, the U.S. gets climate legislation, we go to the Copenhagen Accord, it changes the whole international agreements. Didn't happen, but it could have happened. So there I was in Omaha, Nebraska, in the middle of nowhere. And we're saying, well, it's a big global problem, I can't do anything about it. Nonsense. Your legislator has global significance in the decisions they make. All right, the role of Catholic universities in this situation. It's the Second Vatican Council, okay, in its dogmatic constitution on the Church, Lumen Gentium. It identified the sanctifying mission of the Church and its social mission. It said, quote, "The Church is in Christ as a sacrament or instrumental sign of intimate union with God," its sanctifying mission, "and of the unity of all humanity," its social mission. Okay? Now, to put that somewhat not helpfully theologically, but maybe more receptible to maybe people's thinking, the sanctifying mission is about the person's, what people say, getting to heaven. Right? And that's inadequate theologically, and I hate that the video is doing it, but that kind of communicates it. Getting to heaven, the sanctification of the person, the redemption of the person. And what the Vatican Council said is the social mission of the Church, social justice, is on equal footing. Okay? In light of that, universities now, in light coming out of Vatican II, universities then talk about justice in their Catholic mission statements. Here's another great, I'll pass by this, by probably my favorite lines from the Council. "The joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the men of this age, especially those of the poor, are the joys and hopes and griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ." I think that's one reason that Pope Francis is so popular, because he embodies that in a real way. So, because of this, Lumen Gentium, the identifying the equal sanctifying mission and the social mission, and that universities shift their Catholic understanding. So Catholic, this is my university, Creighton, the Catholic understanding, you look at mission statements across universities, and there's a lot of similarity. The pursuit of truth in all its forms, in the living tradition of the Catholic Church, so the pursuit of truth. The promotion of justice is also there as part of the mission of the university. And then I highlighted there, Creighton exists for students and learning. We're going to talk a little bit about that. All right, so the pursuit of truth and the promotion of justice, right? The pursuit of truth, obviously that's what the university is about. Now the big thing is this promotion of justice piece. What does that mean? Now, what I would like to argue here is that the promotion of justice now, in light of the overwhelming character of the climate problem, the university's promotion of justice is necessary for the pursuit of truth. It's necessary. You can't pursue truth without the promotion of justice in light of the climate problem, the greatest problem the world's probably ever faced. The nuclear problem is a possibility. The climate problem is internalized into everything we do. The overwhelming character of the climate problem and the pursuit of truth. Okay, so the question becomes, can students learn the truth of our situation, the terrible truth? Can they internalize that truth and live in that truth? And now notice that everything we talk about, the climate problem touches everything. If you are interested in peace, you've got to deal with climate change. If you're interested in women's issues, who are the first in conflict? They get hurt. Women. If you're interested in children, you have to deal with the climate problem. If you're interested in civilization, life, you have to deal with the climate problem. There's nothing it doesn't touch. If you're interested in economics, there's nothing it doesn't touch. So it pervades everything in the university now. This is a wonderful book. I highly recommend it. Kari Marie Norgaard from University of Oregon, colleague of Mary Wood. She wrote this interesting book, and basically she tracked Norway. And she showed that Norway is a country very, very literate, highly educated, no resistance to ecological issues, very attuned to ecological issues, highly participatory in government. They're not apathetic in terms of involving in civil society. Nevertheless, the people, and interestingly, or uninteresting, depending on your point of view, they are, because Norway is up near the Arctic Circle is warming 2.5 times faster than the rest of the planet. They're experiencing radical transformation of their way of life. This is their ski resorts in the middle of winter. And their identity. Their identity is wrapped up into that. And nevertheless, she's discovered in her ethnographic study that functionally they accepted climate change intellectually. Functionally, they lived in denial. Now, what's the pattern of living in denial? What happens when you're confronted, as we have been this few days? When you're confronted with the overwhelming character of climate change, you recoil. You recoil. That is to say, you live in denial to avoid fear, helplessness, and guilt. You don't want to pay attention to it. You don't want to talk about it. And it upsets you, and so you don't want to use conversation to inform your neighbor, and they don't like to attend to it either. So functionally, we go on as if the world is okay and the world is threatened. Okay? That's living in denial. You live a double life. There is a deep awareness that we're in real trouble, but you go on as business as usual. Now, what is that live of denial? Is it personal indifference? It's not personal indifference. That means people don't care. They do care. And this is a wonderful book. Nina Ilyasov, another sociologist. Ilyasov did this wonderful study in which she went around to all these volunteer organizations, and she showed that if you ask people privately what they thought about big problems, they asked them about issues, they would express their serious concerns for big problems. Then they get them in a group in their volunteer organization. And what do they talk about? They talk about personal issues. Well, it could affect my kids. They reduced it to personal, small, somewhat self-indulgent issues. Why? She theorizes because there is no capacity within, there is no public discourse of talking about terrible, overwhelming truths or big truths. It's got to be privatized and diminished. Okay? So that's good news. So underneath all that, she's arguing, people really do care. They're not indifferent. All right, so my basic point is here that universities are pillars of society. That is, Gene Sharp was a very influential sociologist talking about how do you move from dictatorships to democracy. And Sharp said, well, there's pillars of society. The fundamental thing you need to know about power and politics is that it requires obedience. Systems require obedience. And so you pull various structures of society. You pull your support away from leaders. Okay, so for instance, I told my students this. The president of our university has no checks and balances. We have a new one, but our former president, no checks and balances. So he's got all the power, right? What happens if students don't show up for a week? School shuts down. President gets sick. He did get sick for 2 months. School didn't shut down. We went right along. Students don't show up, school shuts down. Faculty don't show up, school shuts down. Who's got the power? Not the president. Well, that's true. That's true in our society, too. It requires obedience to the system. What I want to, in my short time left here, I want to suggest that we rethink the university. And we look at the University of Central America. The Jesuits at the University of Central America in the 1980s developed a model of the university that was not simply about teaching and research, but was also about social projection, that the university was an institution in society who, as a university, was politically engaged. And so, for instance, they had many, many different institutes they set up, speaking the truth to power. That's ultimately what got them killed, by the way. 6 of them were murdered. And they did it as a university. That is, both sides. What is the truth? They set up institutions and they gauged society because they thought that the treatment of the El Salvador people was an ultimate negation of reason, and a university could not stand by. And we, in this context, what we're doing is a negation of reason. This is madness. And a university cannot operate simply as a neutral entity in society. We are not a neutral entity in society. Now, that has to be done delicately. That has to be done diplomatically. That has to be done in dialogue, as the Pope has suggested. But the university needs to take public stances. As a university, the Jesuits actually have adopted in their promotion of justice in the university, in their recent documents, what the University of Central America did. And one last note, my time's, I'm sure, up, is what's an example of how you do this? Well, you set up dialogue. So this university, for instance, Carnegie Mellon, what are major institutions within this society, in this city? You enter in at the highest level, someone in mission, vice president up level. You enter into conversation with other universities, other institutions, and then those institutions meet with our political leaders and our big utilities. That's real power. The idea that we teach students and that students will transform the world, that's over now. We're talking 2020 time frame. We're on an emergency scale. That vision is over. The university. And if we do not show, if we show power in society, then when we teach courses on the climate problem, students will not move into denial, and professors won't move into denial. By engaging the university in the political system, we create a condition where we are empowering students and faculty and the community so that they do not live in denial. One final note. Big question that I began with, do we tell the truth on climate change? Living in the truth is its own end. It's uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable. Being comfortable is not an absolute value. The truth is an absolute value. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Nelson Araque. I work for the Catholic Climate Covenant, and in there I am the responsible for the Hispanic affairs. Also, I'm a teacher in a high school. I see some high schoolers here. I know, I understand. Just listen and pay attention. In my organization, we promote the San Francis Pledge. So if you can go online, it would be good for you to join us with the San Francis Pledge. I would like to start with what Pope Francis said to the immigrants in Philadelphia. Don't be discouraged. You bring many gifts to this nation. Never be ashamed of your traditions, which are something that you can bring to enrich the life of this American land. I am Hispanic. I'm talking about Hispanics here. I'm trying to tell you something about the Hispanics, and I am trying to provoke some discussion about the Hispanic understanding of on climate change. Let's talk about with a quote from Janet Rodriguez. She's a professor at Seattle University, Hispanic too. And she said that our Latinidad, our identity as Latinos, resides in three things: the goodness of all God's creation, the created love unfolding in creation. And when we got that, la tierra, the earth, becomes a gift to all creatures. I don't need to tell you this, but Hispanics are growing up. You know, we are probably 51 million right now, and we are here, we are happy, and we want to do something for climate change. My proposal is based on two Hispanic theologians, Alejandro Garcia Rivera, Roberto Goizueta. The first one already died, passed away. Roberto Goizueta is still at Boston College, very active. And what they propose is a recovery of the aesthetic value of creation. Let's start with Alejandro Garcia Rivera. In his book, he says, he has a question: are we at home in the cosmos? And he goes and reflects on Genesis 1, the first account of the creation, and the second account of the creation. In the first account of the creation, the engagement, the human engagement with the cosmos is glorious, is good. In the second, it's about the struggle. But he sees there the mystery. In this glory and struggle, he sees the mystery for humanity and for cosmos. Are we at home in the cosmos? Yes, we are, but we need to learn how to live in it. We need to learn it. And we need to know the inner and other workings of the cosmos. When this call to cosmic knowledge is a mystery for humans, it's a mystery about the cosmos, but still it calls us to be known. If we know the cosmos and how it works, it will tell us how to live in it, and we will receive it as a gift. Remember Avatar? Here. You know, it's when the first approximation that Meiji has. He's interconnected with the cosmos, with the earth. This is what Pope Francis said in Laudato Si, number 81, or in the UN, when he spoke last week. We live in communion with it, since the environment itself entails ethical limits which human activity must acknowledge and respect. We as human beings, we have many, many things. We are unique, we transcend, but at the same time, we belong to the physics and the biology. Actually, our body is shaped by chemicals and biological elements, and we survive if we will survive if we develop an environment that is favorable to us. Everything that we do to the environment, we are doing to ourselves. Let me come back to this here. So where is the theological in this theological cosmology? Is Alejandro Garcia Rivera expressed that point in when we understand the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit as the one who unites us with the beauty and of the creation. So we need to appreciate the beauty. And how can we appreciate that? Through the work of the Holy Spirit. That is one of his points. The other concept is about Fiesta. That is from Roberto Goizueta. So he starts making some kind of or criticize the modern society, the modern subject. He said that the modern subject makes everything. But in this making, it creates a separation between the subject and the object. Actually, that is a precondition for the subject to be a subject. And Pope Francis talked about the same, modern anthropocentrism. The nature and the cosmos is just given as an object of utility, a raw material that we can use on our own understanding. And sometimes we don't understand that. Roberto Goicoechea sees in the separation of the subject from the object the foundation for the devastation of the environment. The same Pope Francis. The Pope Francis talk about technocracy, schizophrenia. You know, when we don't realize the intrinsic value that lesser beings has, we don't realize that. We think that we are the best and we're supposed to do our best and we can plunder, destroy what it was received as a gift. So what is the solution? Postmodernity. Thanks God for postmodernity, because in the postmodernity bring us the homo ludens, the player, the one who has a festive activity, the one who is co-creating. So this is when Roberto Goicoechea brings the topic of fiesta. You may say, oh, Latinos, Hispanics, all the time, they are in parties, in fiestas, and talking. But fiesta actually is our principal form of cultural resistance to the modern notion of the subject. Fiesta reveals the Latino attitudes of receptivity and response. We don't do parties, we do fiestas. Fiesta is something for me. Party is to escape. In the fiesta, I celebrate. I'm grateful for the gift I received from God. In the fiesta, I see that God is the giver of all life. In a party, I cannot do that. The fiesta is made possible many things because I see God's love there. And it called me to be grateful. Laudato Si says something similar in 53. We are called to be instruments of God our Father through the fiesta, through the gratitude, through the understanding of the cosmos. And we will have probably a better situation, and we will understand better God's plan, which is about peace, beauty, and fullness. Fiesta urges one to avoid any form of instrumentalization, objectification of the environment, and respond to our neighbor, especially those who are more vulnerable. It's in the fiesta when Latinos, Hispanics, we join others in their pains. It's in the fiesta when we are one. It's in the fiesta when we show our compassion. Are we doing something about this? This is true? Yeah, we are doing something about it. We are doing something really quick. I want to quote Amber Tafoya, coordinator of Nuestro Rio. And she says, we are taught, Latinos, we are taught that we belong to the land, not the other way around. And we have some data here, some statistics, that Hispanics are recycling. They have recycling habits. And they turn off light when they leave the room. And they own energy sustainable companies. Actually, there is a 2012 survey. And Latinos say we have a moral responsibility to take care of God's creation. And we like outdoor activities. We like to fish, to go to fishing and picnics and camping, all of these things, because it's important for our families, for the bond of our families. These are Hispanics. These are the Latinos. These are the fiesta that we do. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those wonderful papers. Each of them really enriched our conference today by pulling in attention to an element that hadn't been considered before. We have a stakeholder session coming up nearly immediately, but I think we can allow a little bit of time for one or two questions. And I'm hoping that our speakers are going to stick around for lunch, yes? So that if you have more questions than our time frame allows, you'll be able to approach them directly in order to engage them in conversation. So do we have a question or two in the audience at this moment? So in the back of the room. And Stephen, will you make it clear whether or not you're directing it to one of the speakers or all?
My question is directed to Dr. Miller. You spoke about the university's role in providing hope through political action. And in keeping with concerns of Catholic social teaching regarding solidarity and the rights of workers with living wage, I wonder if universities can begin to promote justice and the pursuit of truth by providing their adjuncts with a living wage as one way of beginning that process.
Yeah, of course. I mean, 70% of, in the United States, 70% of teaching now is done by non-tenured adjuncts or resident assistant, associate, or resident visiting professors, something like that, but non-tenured faculty. At Creighton, it's not that way. I imagine it's not that. Those numbers aren't at Duquesne. But it's a huge problem, and it's exploitative of labor. People who have the job, who are very qualified PhDs, working for terrible wages. So, yeah, I think all of those things, the universities have to integrate all aspects of Catholic social teaching. I mean, you know, let me say it a little stronger here. Why is Pope Francis so popular? I mean, it's amazing because he embodies what the teachings are suggesting. He embodies the gospel to the best that he can in a position where he could easily move off into a very gilded life. And he tries, he resists it, he visits the poor, the sick, the imprisoned, mercy. And our universities should take note of that. The desire to pick students, get students to flourish economically. Let's not lose fact that people do, deep down, care about the truth and care about the good. And if we witness to it, they will come.
One more question? Okay, shall we move into our large group conversation? Please join me in thanking our speakers once again.